Welcome to episode 12 of The Pulpiteer. I'm your host, Eric Hepburn, and I'm glad to have you join us for today's episode. Today's podcast is entitled, Questions More Profound Than Answers. I'm going to start this week with a caveat and a reading. The caveat is that the bulk of this podcast was recorded live while I was delivering the sermon, and it was a Q&A style sermon where congregants submitted questions in advance. Next week we'll have a live Q&A, so if there's a different feel to the delivery in the audio, that's the reason. All right, for your consideration, 3 quotes on questions. The first one, scientific. Quote, "That is the essence of science. Ask an impertinent question, and you are on the way to a pertinent answer." End quote. Jacob Bronowski. The second one, religious. Quote, "Being religious means asking passionately the question of the meaning of our existence and being willing to receive answers even if the answers hurt." End quote. Paul Tillich. The final quote, mystical. Quote, "Don't search for the answers which could not be given to you now because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps then, someday far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer." End quote. Rainer Maria Rilke. Questions more profound than answers, and a mic that I keep making ring. So, I got some great questions from you all. I expected no less. We're going to start with something a little funny. Why should I stay in Texas? Now, I wasn't expecting a sort of party question. Although, at least in my circles, this question has been going around as a party question for, let's just say, 8 years or so. But I owe you all something more than a party response, so let's start here. There isn't a generalizable right answer to this question. I would say this, if you've only ever lived in Texas, maybe you should try living somewhere else. Maybe you'll decide to come back. Maybe the answer to why you should leave Texas you won't know until you left and tried someplace else and remembered or realized or found what you love about that home place that you never saw before you left. So, if you're a native Texan, maybe getting out of Texas is exactly what you need. What are you looking for if you're thinking about getting out? Interesting little science fact to throw in here. The grass is greener. But here's the trick. That statement isn't a fact about the optics of grass, not about the insufficiency of your current location. So the grass looks greener because that's the way grass and light interact. If we wanted to write one of those as if biological evolution stories about it, we would say that if you're making grazing creatures and something that they graze upon, you want them to keep moving. If they stay in the same place too long, they'll eat the grass down to the nubs and then it won't grow back. But we don't need that kind of story. So, are you looking to leave Texas because you want to avoid conflict? maybe you don't think about it like this, but maybe you want to live somewhere a little more homogeneous, maybe around people who think like you more, maybe living around people who believe different things than you is making you uncomfortable. But I think we'll get to this a little later on, but if we really believe what a lot of you say, that we don't have to think alike, to love alike, is that enough of an answer to the question about whether you should leave? For me, I think this, we are each of us here this morning together in Texas, and I don't think that's a coincidence. For me, it feels more like fate. And if my fate calls me elsewhere, I will go. One of the things I'm struggling with in Stephen Jenkinson's writings recently is he places a lot of emphasis on being of a place and from a place. A lot of emphasis on knowing where your ancestors are buried, about recognizing Uncle Tom or Aunt Marjorie in the leaves of the trees blooming in the field in your community. He says that one of the things he thinks is wrong with our culture is that we've kind of forgotten about our ancestry and where we've came from, and we've forgotten that we belong to places. We've all become abstract citizens, but not grounded humans. I'm not sure how to integrate that, but I thought I'd share it with you. All right, on to our next question. Now that first one was anonymous. I had a volunteer who wants to take credit for that one. All right, fair enough. What does our faith require us to do? And this question comes to us from our vice president 2 years running, Mr. Keith Hutchinson. It's a good question. I'm going to start by picking it apart. Who's our? There's an our in the sentence. What does our faith require us to do? Well, last time that I checked, we are part of a religious movement that is non-creedal. If we're non-creedal, then who is our? Can we define a faith without a creed? It's an interesting question. Do we mean the people in this room, the members of our congregation? Do we mean Unitarian Universalists worldwide? Do we mean the people of Georgetown, of Texas, of the Americas? Do we mean liberals? Who do we mean when we say our? I know it's aspirational, but the word human is about the smallest bubble that I'm willing to both draw and prioritize. Now, that might be fantasy. Maybe I want to live in a Lord of the Rings elven village where I preach on Sunday under the canopy of the trees, and even the birds and animals come and listen to the sermon. I want to be part of a circle of life that big. So I wonder about who we are. Now let's talk about the other key word in the sentence. Let's talk about faith. Faith has some interesting opposites. You'll find a lot of controversy on the old internet out there about what the opposites of faith are. Here are the ones that I like. The opposite of faith is control or certainty or fear. Let's unpack that a little bit. The positive definition of faith, there are two of them. First one is complete trust or confidence in someone or something, and the second one is a strong belief in God or in the doctrines of a religion based on spiritual apprehension rather than proof. I have about 9 problems with those two definitions, so let's unpack that a little bit. So, I think that the idea that spiritual apprehension and proof are at odds and not aligned is an artifact of immaturity, not of the differing nature of spirit and matter. I think that science and earnest spirituality point in the same direction. They are fingers pointing at the same moon. They are not movements of society and culture that are at odds with one another. We, as human beings, we like to use our intellect to slice things up into pieces for analytical purposes. And this is a good and valid use of our intellectual capacities. But to mistake the slices we make for the nature of reality itself is to make a fundamental error that disregards the deep interconnectedness of all things. It gets us to a paradox, doesn't it? I'm going to touch both sides of this paradox. I hope you feel them both deeply. You are amazing and unique and irreplaceable and unduplicatable in the entire history of this universe and the universes before this one and the universes after and parallel to this one. You are a one of one. And you don't matter as much as your ego would like to believe. Now, that is a paradox. You see, you are both irreplaceable and, in a mathematical sense, insignificant, but not insignificant. They say that spiritual deepening happens when we're able to hold both sides of a paradox, the truth of both sides of a paradox within our heart and within our mind without going cuckoo. So I invite you to hold on to this. You are necessary to the unfolding of the universe. And you're not as central to that story as your mind would have you believe. So we've talked about spiritual apprehension versus proof. All right, let's talk about something else. A strong belief in doctrine. We've already covered the fact that we are non-doctrinal sorts of people, despite all the argumentation about rewriting Article 2. So we're not, but maybe that's another paradox. Maybe we still want to capture in words something to hold on to, something to share with others that helps them understand what it is that we do here and what it is that we are to each other. So, strong belief in God or the doctrines of a religion, a complete trust or confidence in someone or something. I like this strand that I found. Maybe the opposite of faith is disobedience. Now, that will rumple several feathers, so let's ask, what is it that we're being obedient or disobedient to? And I don't mean human authority here, and I don't want to invoke an immature vision of the divine here. But what I do want to say is to use a word from Stephen Jenkinson's language, the nap of life. Life has a discernible grain to it. It has a flow. It has a way of being itself. And when we pay attention to the life within us and the life around us, when we pay attention to the way it flows, we can find ourselves flowing with life instead of fighting against life. That is where I think the word disobedient becomes brilliant. Have we known some people who try to fight life? I think we do. I think many a sorrow has been spilled over their plight, but rarely a joy. When you think about people whose way of showing up to life you struggle not to envy, you'll notice that they are people who seem to have mastered the nap of life. They know how to flow with it, to be sad when it's time to be sad, to be happy when it's time to be happy, to ignore the rules when they're not needed, and to follow the rules when they provide a structure for things that helps us thrive and live and do what we do. I'm going to move now to the next question. It's a dovetail of a bit. This one comes from our good friend Billy Adams. UUism is all about love, but do we show enough love? Well, Unitarian Universalism just recentered its entire value system around love. And you all know that I am a proponent personally of love's transformative power. So let's dovetail this with our previous question and ask, is love the center of faith? Is it something in which we could have complete trust and confidence? Is that trust in love, that confidence in love, a product of spiritual apprehension, even in a world where perhaps the evidence feels mixed and there are competing theories about how to be human? Now, I already hinted at this. I think if you really read the good research, you'll find that it points in the same direction as the wisdom traditions about the value of love and what it does in the world. So I like the idea that love is at the center of faith. We're going to dovetail into another question, this one from Linda Mueller. How do you define God? I replied to Linda's email and I said, that's not a 5-minute answer. That's like a 5-week sermon series. But we're going to take a swing at it this morning. Define is an interesting word. One way to think about defining is to think about it as a box made of words that encompasses and bounds a concept, right? So we use our words to draw a box around a concept, and then we think, I got it now. I know it. It belongs to me. We can think about it as ownership. In general, I don't think God is a word that is susceptible to that kind of definition. I like to think of it more like this, as the Buddhists say, the finger pointing at the moon is not the moon. So I think we can use words and other concepts to point toward the concept of God without claiming that we have contained God in ways that specify our knowledge and that the thing being spoken about is beyond that kind of pigeonholing. So it's been said that God is love. And for many of us, this feels like just simply equating two enigmas. I'm not sure it gets us closer to understanding. It's been more contentiously proposed that love is God, as if language is subject to the transitive property. Now, a third term tends to enter this formulation. Life equals love equals God, but not necessarily in that order. Certainly deeply implying an immutability in the relationship among these three concepts, God and love and life. A different kind, perhaps, of Holy Trinity. So we come then to one of my favorite definitions of God, this one from Eckhart Tolle. What is God? The eternal one life underneath all the forms of life. What is love? To feel the presence of the one life deep within yourself and all creatures. To be it. Therefore, all love is the love of God. To put it in other words, you and life are one. You and God are one. When you experience that oneness, That's life's longing for itself. We call that love. We can experience that love sometimes as joy. We experience that love sometimes as sorrow. I'm going to move to another question. This one comes to us from Keith Lovin. What reasons are there for an educated non-believer to attend SGUUF except for community and hopefully thoughtful, inspirational, informative, challenging, and provocative messages? I appreciate that many adjectives, Keith. I really do. I'm going to pick it apart a little bit again. Non-believer. What does that mean? Is it equivalent to Richard Dawkins' disbelief in the flying spaghetti monster? Look, I was a hardcore atheist for a long time. And when I was, I used an overly simplistic view of other people's religion as a way of making fun of them, as a way of holding myself superior. And after a while, I realized that I was doing the same thing as an atheist that I had done as an evangelical free will Pentecostal. I had an identity that I was ego invested in, and I was sure that I was right, and I looked down on anybody who disagreed. So I decided not to repeat that pattern. I started attending a UU church, but I did not adopt a UU identity. Instead of looking for the most immature, banal, and dismissible definitions of God, I started looking for the wisest, most profound, and deepest ones. That part of my own journey started about 21 years ago, and it continues to this day. It brought me to this pulpit. As Eckhart Tolle says, when we use religion in the service of the ego, all religions are the same. All right, so we've talked about just one word of Keith's question. Let's move on to some others. Community. Well, it's good and necessary, but is it enough to draw you here? Is it enough to keep you showing up to Sunday morning? There are other forms of it. Some of them, called brunch, come with food and cocktails. It's a high bar. Look, I think we put on a pretty good show here, all things considered. But is it enough to keep you coming back every Sunday? Now, I took a pretty mystical approach to this question in my message entitled, Why Church? But let me try today the opposite tact. Let me try the opposite of the mystical. Let me try the scientific tact on this question. Let's begin this way. Y'all are familiar with the old saw about a bunch of blind people trying to figure out what an elephant is, right? Now, there's a concept called a meta-analysis or a meta-theory that says, what if we took all those descriptions of all those blind people and we systematically evaluated them to piece back together a picture of what that bigger thing might be? So there's an author named Ken Wilber who has done that kind of meta-analysis about human development across social, psychological, and spiritual dimensions. He's been doing this work for about 40 years. I've been reading him for about 25 years. I'm not a devotee of his, but he says a lot of things that I think make good sense. So he lays out a pretty compelling and comprehensive overview of individual and collective human development and of the dovetailed sociocultural evolution that happens as we move forward over time through different phases of social, cultural, and national evolution. Now, I cannot do his theory justice in 5 minutes or 50 minutes, so I'm just going to highlight two things that I think are relevant to Keith's question. The first is that we have and there are multiple intelligences. So there's what we typically think of as cognitive intelligence, There's emotional intelligence, there's moral intelligence, there's aesthetic intelligence. The ongoing work in this field comes up with lists somewhere between 8 primary lines of development and 24 primary lines of development that happen within human beings. So, for example, some people break the aesthetic thing into musical and sculpture and visual, for example. There are some who argue that kinesthetic is one. There are some who argue that relational is one. But whether you are looking at the 8-line version or the 24-line version, almost all the models include spiritual intelligence. So let's talk about what that means for a minute. Spiritual intelligence comes from the work of a fellow Texan, if I'm not mistaken, James W. Fowler. He was a professor of theology and human development at Emory University, and he defined 6 stages of the evolution of spiritual intelligence. And I will say that the new atheists are stuck at stage 4 on a 6-stage model. So now, am I arguing for progress for its own sake? No. But here's how spiritual intelligence dovetails with spiritual experience. And we're going to talk about spiritual experience in a second. When we have bona fide spiritual experiences, out in nature, listening to music, watching a film, doing art, meditating, whatever it is that you do, where you experience that oneness, that stillness within yourself, that connection with the larger world, however that happens for you, you interpret that moment in your life at whatever level of spiritual intelligence you're on, which is why you can have culturally primitive tribal people who are having peak spiritual experiences, but all they see is their local deity in that experience. That doesn't delegitimate their spiritual experience. As a matter of fact, you can compare their language about their spiritual experience to those of advanced meditators in Buddhism who also have PhDs, and you'll find that what they experience is very similar. Spiritual experiences are a real and documented thing. Some of us do it while we're fishing in a river in our waders, and some of it find it doing a variety of other things. The fact that not all of us find it doing the same things is of great comfort to me. I'm very skeptical about this idea that there's only one way to get to God. I think it's done a lot of harm, the idea that there's one right way to do spirituality. So let's define spiritual intelligence. It is the ability to create meaning based on deep understanding of existential questions, awareness, and the ability to use multiple levels of consciousness in problem solving. So you have this experience of oneness, and you interpret it based on your development of spiritual intelligence. And that's something that I think isn't happening anywhere else in your life other than this church. I don't think anybody else out there cares whether or not you are practicing and working on and learning to deepen your own spiritual intelligence. So I think church does 2 things. I think it's not the only source of spiritual experience, but it can be one. And I hope for us to find ways I'm going to sidebar into Jackie's question, which is, what is the role of music? Well, luckily, the research says that about 30% of us are really highly susceptible to having spiritual experiences from music, right? Not all of us. Some of us just listen to music and we're like, oh, that's nice. And for some of us, it is a gateway to something much deeper. And so music is indispensable for our worship services, as are moments of silence, as are the introduction of language and paradox and a bunch of other stuff. So like the Zen masters say, we might have to break your thinking mind to get you a minute of quiet. And in that moment of quiet, You might realize that you're not as alone as you thought you were. All right. So I think that's one reason to come to church, is because we know through our science and our research as well as our reflection that both spiritual experiences and spiritual intelligence are real human things. And this is the place where we cultivate those. I want to help you cultivate your spiritual intelligence so that your experiences of love and life and joy and sorrow can be deeper and more meaningful experiences in your life. There's a sports expression that I know now and I wish I had known before I destroyed both of my ankles playing soccer. You train to play. You don't play to train. Spiritual experience is the play, and cultivating spiritual intelligence is the training. I don't want you slipping a soul disc when you're out there on the river, Keith. All right. How are we doing on time? Can I get a thumbs up or thumbs down? All right. I got a couple more questions here. I didn't pre-write answers for these. Molly Hornbuckle asked me after a service, how do we metabolize fear? I gave a sermon and I said that hatred is unmetabolized fear. And after the events of yesterday, I'm sure that all of us can feel at least a little bit of that energy moving around in our chest. Not sure whether it's fear or hatred or a toxic mix of both. The best answer I can find you is that we learn to metabolize fear by learning to grieve. That means that when we feel that sorrow welling up in us, our first reaction is not, get back down, go away, I gotta hold it together. I gotta hold it together today. Can't do this. Damn it. What is so hard about crying in front of another human being? Look, I'm going to tell it to you straight. It is not that hard. Our young children know how to do it. They only stopped doing it because we traumatized them. They only stopped crying in front of us because we told them it wasn't okay. Grown people at memorial services for people they deeply love come up to me, and all I'm trying to do is get them to touch that big ball of sadness in their chest because their loss is real and it matters. And they come up to me and tell me they're just trying to keep it together. And I'm like, for what? Are you trying to impress somebody else in this group by holding it together? Is that what you think is important right now? Your mother or father or loved one just died and left a gaping hole in your life, and you're worried about whether they think you've got it together? Good heavens. I mean, I know we're a social species, and I know we matter to each other, but sometimes we just prioritize the wrong stuff. We just prioritize the wrong stuff. I don't know if I've told you this already, but right after I took this job, I was with my sister, and we were talking, and she said, man, so like, what are you going to do? What's your litmus test for success? I said, if I can have one Sunday when we all cry together, I'll know I'm doing something worth doing. I know we're a little ways from that now. It's all right. It's all right. We don't got to get there quick. But there's a trajectory to what we're doing here. And learning to become honest and vulnerable with our emotions again is part of that spiritual journey. Look, if we don't heal the traumas we were dealt, we will pass them on to the next generation, wittingly or unwittingly. I've said it before and I'm going to say it again. Our job is to find our own healing. That job is a job that we need each other for. And then you can start handing out healing instead of trauma to the people in your life. God, isn't that worth praying for? Isn't that worth working for? Isn't it worth having a little discomfort to get that? I'm going to tell you a story. So I told you that my dad's suffering from stage 4 cancer. And we were driving together. My son's 15. I'm teaching him how to drive. I'm driving my dad to the airport after spending the day with him. And we're about to pull up to the airport. And I'm in the right lane. I'm doing the right thing. But it's Orlando International Airport, and we've been sitting in stop-and-go traffic for about 15 minutes heading into the airport. And everything's cool. And the sudden, he just starts screaming at me. You're in the wrong lane. You're in the wrong lane. Move, 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 move. And I'm just like, no, it's okay. I'm in the right lane. And then he's like, oh, I'm sorry. I'm like, it's all right, Dad. It's all good. It's all right. Thank you for apologizing. I had been doing that to my son. I had been treating driving like it was that fucking important. I had screamed at him like, get in the other lane, get in the other lane, get in the other lane, and then apologized to him afterwards. I had been doing it for months. Now, not all the time. I'm not that big of a jerk, but, I would get panicked like we all do in traffic sometimes. Oh my God, if I don't make this exit, something terrible is going to happen. Why? What has got our underwear in such a wad that we mistake whether or not we have to drive an extra exit and go around the block for something that we need to be stressed about? Good Lord, people shoot each other over this stuff. It's crazy. Look, folks, we can be crazy in a crazy world and we'll fit in just fine. But I want to invite you to something else. I want to invite you to a place where you feel like the rest of the world is crazy and you might be the only sane one. It's a better place to be. And the stuff going on out there is mostly crazy. It is mostly crazy. And it's mostly just misguided misprioritization. So I have stopped yelling at my son when I'm driving, mostly. I'm still working on it. But the apologies are genuine now. The apology is not, I'm so sorry I did that, but I'm going to do it to you again in 3 days. The apology is now, okay, I just had to apologize for this again. And the goal is to never have to do this apology again. Not because I stopped apologizing, but because I stopped the behavior. Anybody in here have any experience with apologizing for the same things over and over again? Amen? I just want you to take that moment seriously in your life. That is life inviting you to notice that something's not right in you. And I don't mean wrongness, like I don't want you to get self-conscious. I don't want you to beat yourself up. I want you to recognize that life is inviting you to be the best version of you. Life is inviting you. It said, hey, you recognized that this isn't how you want to be in the world. So stop. Look for another way. Ask yourself, man, am I just playing out some thing that happened to me when I was younger? That's a lot of it. Maybe I've taken efficiency so seriously as a concept. Maybe I grew up in a family where they were just like, hey, stop playing, get the work done. And they taught me that that's what was important in life. Getting the work done. More important than finding joy. Getting the work done. More important than playing a game. The question at dinner table isn't, did you have fun today? What brought you joy today? The question is, did you get all your chores done? How are your grades in school? You are what you accomplish. I don't want to hear about the rest of it. I'm not interested. It's all ego, folks. It's all ego. It's all ego. And it's not that we can't accomplish or do or think or deploy our amazing intellect or our artistic abilities if we rejigger the system. I'm going to tell you a secret. We're going to get more out of our intellect when our intellect is the servant of our will instead of its master. We're going to get more out of artistic expression when our artistic expression is brought into being by a will that is love-centered than we do if we're slaves to our own productions. So I'm not inviting us to become primitivized. I'm inviting us to advance across the board, spiritually, intellectually, emotionally, culturally, aesthetically. Don't shirk any part of your life. I'm just going to invite us to a moment of silence here. I just want you to close your eyes for a minute and recognize what an unbelievable gift it is to be alive, to feel the life in your body and your heart and your mind. For this 3-part sermon series, I will be using the benediction that inspired it. I feel the need, though, to make a credit and another caveat. The credit for this benediction belongs to Reverend Dr. Davidson Lohr, who was the first minister who invited me to ever preach in their pulpit, and who was also the minister at the First UU Church of Austin when I first joined that congregation. And those are two things for which I will forever be grateful. The caveat is this: my honoring him in this way is not an endorsement of all of his views, theological or political. It is simply an expression of my gratitude and an acknowledgement that this piece of work, the benediction, resonates for me. May you find questions more profound than answers, vulnerability more powerful than strength, and a peace that passeth all understanding. Until next time, thank you for joining us on The Pulpiteer. The Pulpiteer podcast is a production of the San Gabriel Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Georgetown, Texas. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can make a donation at sangabrieluu.org/give. The podcast is hosted by Spotify, and theme music is by John Faber. The podcast is written, produced, and performed by Eric Hepburn.